The red recording light was already on when the room fell silent. Tape reels spun behind glass. Cigarette smoke hung in the air like a held breath. In front of the mixing console, a 12-year-old boy raised his hand and stopped history mid-motion, just as an engineer's finger hovered over the erase button. "Don't clean that track," Michael Jackson said softly. "That's the groove." Motown Studios, early 1970s. The building itself seemed to hum, as if the walls had absorbed every hit record that had ever passed through them. The floor creaked with decades of rhythm. This was a place run by precision, discipline, and rules written by adults who had spent their lives chasing perfection. And standing in the center of it all was Michael Jackson, barely tall enough to see over the console without leaning forward. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss another untold story. At 12 years old, Michael had already been performing longer than most singers twice his age. He had toured, rehearsed, smiled on command, and learned how to deliver emotion on cue. But inside the studio, something different happened. The stage was gone. The audience was gone. What remained was sound, and Michael heard it differently. This session was supposed to be routine. Another take, another polish, another step toward vinyl. The song itself was strong, but the producers wanted it clean, tight, controlled. Motown didn't sell rough edges. Motown sold perfection. As the track played back, the engineers frowned. Somewhere in the recording there was a sound they didn't like. A breath held too long, a foot shifting on the floor, a faint, uneven pulse that didn't align with the metronome. "Noise," one of them muttered. The engineer reached forward. That was when Michael Jackson spoke. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it wasn't defiant, it was certain. "Don't erase that." The room froze. This was a studio where seasoned professionals made decisions in seconds, where children were expected to listen, not interrupt, where 12-year-olds definitely did not overrule engineers who had been cutting records before Michael was born. The engineer turned around slowly. He didn't hide his surprise. "Why not?" he asked. Michael didn't answer right away. He closed his eyes. That was something people were starting to notice about him. When Michael listened, he didn't just hear. He entered the sound. His head tilted slightly, as if he were stepping inside the music itself. "That's the groove," Michael finally said. "If you take it out, the song won't breathe." The adults exchanged looks. Groove, breathing. These were abstract words coming from a child in a room ruled by technical standards. They played the section again. To the engineers, it still sounded imperfect, but Michael began to move just slightly. His shoulder dipped. His fingers tapped against his leg. His foot found the beat the machines couldn't measure. "That part," Michael said, pointing without opening his eyes. "That's where it feels alive." This wasn't guesswork. This wasn't ego. This was instinct refined by thousands of hours on stage, listening to crowds respond not to precision, but to feeling. The engineer hesitated. Vinyl didn't forgive mistakes. Radio didn't reward risks. Leaving that sound meant trusting a 12-year-old over decades of studio convention. "Let's clean it," someone else suggested. Michael opened his eyes. "If you erase it," he said quietly, "you erase the heartbeat." Silence again. And then something rare happened in Motown Studios. They listened to the kid. They let the tape roll. They kept the sound. In the days that followed, no one talked about it much. The track moved forward. The song was pressed. The world heard it without knowing what had almost been removed. But something felt different. The record didn't sound sterile. It didn't sound manufactured. It moved. It pulled listeners in without them understanding why. DJs noticed it. Dancers felt it. Audiences responded to something they couldn't name. A so-called mistake had become the soul of the song. Years later, engineers would point to moments like this as proof that Michael Jackson wasn't just a performer. He was a producer in a child's body. He understood rhythm not as math, but as emotion. Not as timing, but as life. What made this moment extraordinary wasn't that Michael was right. It was how he was right. He didn't argue. He didn't demand. He listened deeper than anyone else in the room and trusted what his body told him. Where others heard imperfection, he heard humanity. This philosophy would follow Michael Jackson for the rest of his career. Breaths would stay in. Footsteps would remain. Fingers snapping slightly off beat would become part of the texture. He would later insist on capturing first takes, raw vocals, and spontaneous sounds that engineers once tried to eliminate. Because to Michael, music wasn't supposed to be flawless. It was supposed to be felt. That day at Motown didn't make headlines. There were no cameras, no applause, just a boy, a tape machine, and a decision that quietly shifted how people thought about sound. Perfection, Michael understood, wasn't about removing every mistake. Perfection was knowing which mistakes to keep. And in that control room, a 12-year-old taught a room full of professionals a lesson they would carry forever. Today, when we listen back to those early recordings, we're not just hearing songs. We're hearing courage, instinct, and a voice still young, still learning, that already knew something the world would spend decades trying to understand. Sometimes the thing that makes a record immortal is the very thing someone tried to erase. And sometimes, history changes because a child says one simple sentence at exactly the right moment. Don't erase that sound. The tape machine did not know what it had just witnessed. It kept spinning, indifferent, recording magnetized particles onto brown ribbon, unaware that a quiet line had been crossed in that room. Outside Motown Studios, Detroit moved on as usual. Cars passed. Radios played. No one stopped in the street. No headlines were written. No producer announced that history had shifted by a few degrees. But inside that control room, something irreversible had happened. Because once Michael Jackson had said it, once a 12-year-old had stopped an erase button with nothing but conviction, there was no going back to the old way of listening. The engineers didn't argue anymore, not that day. They leaned back in their chairs and listened again, not with their eyes on the meters, not with their hands on the faders, but with something they hadn't used much in years: their gut. The sound was still there, slightly uneven, human, alive. One engineer finally nodded, almost to himself. "All right," he said, "we'll keep it." Michael didn't smile. That's what surprised people later when they talked about moments like this. He didn't celebrate. He didn't act triumphant. He simply exhaled as if something heavy had been set down. To him, this wasn't a victory. It was a correction. Because to Michael Jackson, music was not about authority. It was about truth. And truth, he believed, even at 12, had a sound. The session continued. Vocals were layered, harmonies were stacked, instructions were given and followed, but the room felt different now, subtly, almost imperceptibly, as if everyone present had been reminded that rules were tools, not laws. Someone glanced at Michael while he waited for the next cue. He stood with his headphones resting around his neck, eyes lowered, fingers tapping a rhythm no one else could hear. This was another thing that set him apart. Even when the music stopped, it didn't stop inside him. Later that evening, after the session wrapped, one of the older musicians asked him about it. "How do you know which parts to keep?" the man asked. "I mean, how do you hear that?" Michael thought for a moment. "I don't hear it," he said. "I feel it first." That answer stayed with people. Because that was the difference. Most artists learned music from the outside in. Michael learned it from the inside out. And this mistake at Motown became something like a quiet origin story, not just for a song, but for a philosophy that would define everything he touched. As the years passed, those early Motown sessions became legend. Engineers who had been there would tell the story differently each time, but the core never changed. A kid, an erase button, a sound that shouldn't have survived. And yet it did. When Michael Jackson grew older, when his voice changed, and his name grew larger than the buildings he once recorded in, people began to notice something strange about his music. It didn't sound perfect. It sounded present. You could hear his breath between lines. You could hear his foot hitting the floor. You could hear little vocal sounds, gasps, hiccups, whispered syllables that didn't belong to the lyrics but belonged to the moment. Producers tried to remove them. Michael refused. Over and over again, across decades, he would say some version of the same sentence he'd said at 12. Don't take that out. That's where it feels real. By the time he was an adult, people listened when he said it. But at Motown, no one was supposed to listen to him yet. That's what makes that early 1970 session so important. It wasn't just about sound. It was about trust. Trusting instinct over instruction, feeling over formula, humanity over polish. Motown had built an empire on discipline, on rehearsed smiles and precise steps and radio-friendly symmetry. And yet, the most enduring thing to come out of those rooms was often the thing that almost didn't make it. Michael sensed that long before he had the language to explain it. In later interviews, he would talk about how music should move people physically, not just emotionally. How a groove wasn't something you measured, it was something you surrendered to. That idea can be traced back to moments like this one. A 12-year-old boy, surrounded by experts, choosing to trust his body over the board. And the board for once stepping back. The record went out into the world, people danced to it, they sang along, they felt something they couldn't quite name. They didn't know they were hearing a near erasure. They didn't know a child had intervened. They just knew it felt good. That's how most iconic moments work. They hide inside ordinary outcomes. Years later, when Michael Jackson would stand in much larger studios, rooms filled with cutting-edge technology, digital perfection, infinite undo buttons, he would still chase the same thing he'd protected at Motown. That feeling. Engineers who worked with him as an adult often described the same behavior. Michael packing the room, Michael dancing while listening to playback, Michael stopping everything to replay a half-second of sound. Right there, he'd say, "Did you feel that?" Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes he made them listen again. And again. Until they did. Because Michael wasn't chasing perfection. He was chasing connection. And connection, he learned early, lived in the cracks. The breath before the note. The shuffle before the beat. The sound that didn't belong, but somehow made everything belong. That 12-year-old who stopped an erase button grew into an artist who redefined pop music. But the instinct never changed. In a world obsessed with cleaning things up, Michael Jackson spent his life leaving things in. Leaving evidence that a human had been there. Leaving room for movement. Leaving space for the listener to step inside the song. And it all traces back to a moment that lasted less than 60 seconds. A finger hovering. A voice interrupting. A decision to listen. If that engineer had pressed erase, we would never know what we lost. That's the frightening part of history. Most erased moments disappear without protest. But this one didn't. Because a child spoke. Because adults paused. Because music, for once, was allowed to breathe. And maybe that's the real lesson of this story. That greatness doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it sounds like a mistake. Sometimes it's a 12-year-old saying, "Don't erase that sound." The truth is, the room never fully went back to normal after that. Even when the lights were turned off. even when the reels were boxed and labeled, even when the boy went home and the adult stayed behind. Because once you've heard something, you can't unhear it. One of the engineers lingered after everyone else left. He rewound the tape alone, listening again, not as part of a job but as a private act of curiosity. He focused on the section Michael had defended, that faint irregularity, that barely perceptible push and pull. And for the first time, he stopped thinking like an engineer. He imagined a living room somewhere, a teenager turning up the radio, a body responding before the brain had time to judge. He imagined motion. He imagined people. That was when it clicked. The so-called noise wasn't noise at all. It was timing that refused to be mechanical. It was groove that leaned forward instead of standing still. It was human inconsistency doing exactly what machines could never do on their own. He exhaled, leaned back, and laughed quietly to himself. Kid was right, he muttered. But he didn't say it out loud, not yet. In the early 1970s, studios weren't places of emotional humility. They were places of control. Authority flowed from age, from experience, from proximity to the console. Children, even prodigies, were expected to stay in their lane. What Michael Jackson had done wasn't just musical. It was cultural. Without meaning to, he had challenged a hierarchy that no one questioned. Not by arguing, not by rebelling, but by listening better. And that is far more threatening than defiance. Because you can dismiss rebellion. You cannot dismiss results. Over the next weeks, the song began to circulate internally. Producers noticed something. Dancers responded to it differently. The groove lingered longer in the body. The record felt loose, in a good way. No one mentioned the erased or not erased sound. But everyone felt its effect. This is how influence often works. It moves invisibly, through sensation rather than explanation. By the time people realize it's there, it's already part of the system. Michael, meanwhile, went on being 12. He went to rehearsals, he took notes, he listened more than he spoke, but something had changed inside him too, not pride, something quieter. Confirmation, a small internal voice had been validated, the one that said, trust what you feel, even when others don't. That voice would become one of the most important instruments he ever owned. As Michael entered his teenage years, the industry around him grew louder. Expectations multiplied, pressures increased, his voice changed, his body changed, his world accelerated. But the way he listened never did. In studio after studio, city after city, he repeated the same ritual. Headphones on, eyes closed, body moving, feeling first, explaining later if at all. Sometimes producers understood immediately. Sometimes they didn't. But one thing became clear. Michael Jackson wasn't interested in music that only sounded good on paper. He wanted music that moved through people. That idea would eventually collide with technology itself. As recording equipment evolved, studios became cleaner, more precise, more forgiving. Every imperfection could be isolated, corrected, erased. The erase button became easier to press. And Michael became more resistant to it. Engineers who worked with him in later years would tell similar stories. He'd stop playback suddenly. Go back, he'd say. They'd rewind. Further. Rewind. There, he'd say, that sound. An engineer might respond, that's just a breath. Michael would nod. Exactly. To him, that breath was proof that the voice came from a body, that a person had been there in that moment, that the performance wasn't manufactured, it was experienced. What most artists tried to hide, Michael highlighted. And it all traces back to that early lesson, that perfection without soul is forgettable. The irony is that Michael Jackson would become synonymous with perfection, precision dancing, immaculate production, flawless execution. But underneath All of that was a deep respect for the imperfect. His perfection wasn't sterile. It was alive. And that distinction matters. Because when people talk about why Michael's music still feels present decades later, they often struggle to explain it. They talk about melodies, beats, choreography, charisma. But those are outcomes. The cause was listening. Listening beyond the obvious, beyond the technical, beyond what could be measured or taught. Listening for the moment when sound becomes feeling. That moment, once found, must be protected, even from erasure. As the years went on, the Motown era receded into history. Studios changed, faces changed, tape gave way to digital files, but that story passed quietly from engineer to engineer, never fully disappeared. A kid once stopped us from erasing something. A kid once heard what we couldn't. A kid once reminded us why we started doing this in the first place. It became a kind of folklore among those who knew, not because it was dramatic, but because it was instructive. A reminder that sometimes the most important voice in the room isn't the loudest or the oldest, but the most attentive. Michael never framed it as a lesson. He never went back and said, "Remember when I was right." He didn't need to. His career became the proof. Every time a song of his made people move before they understood why, that 12-year-old in Motown was still speaking. Every time a so-called imperfection became iconic, that erase button stayed unpressed. Every time someone felt something they couldn't explain, the groove survived. And perhaps the most powerful part of this story is that it could have ended differently. The engineer could have pressed erase. The tape could have been cleaned. The moment could have vanished without consequence. History is full of erased sounds we never got to hear. But this one stayed. Because someone listened. Because someone trusted a child. Because someone allowed music to remain human. That's why this story matters. Not because it's about fame. Not because it's about genius. But because it's about attention. In a world obsessed with fixing, polishing, correcting, Michael Jackson showed us the courage it takes to leave something alone. To say this is enough, this is alive. And maybe that's why his music continues to outlive trends, formats, and generations. Because it was never just engineered. It was felt. Years later, when people tried to pinpoint the exact moment Michael Jackson stopped being just a talented child and became something else, something deeper, something more dangerous to ignore, they often missed it. Because it didn't happen on stage. It didn't happen under spotlights. It didn't happen when the crowd screamed. It happened in rooms like that one. Quiet rooms, controlled rooms, rooms where power usually flowed in one direction. Those rooms were where Michael learned the most important lesson of his life, that music was not created by authority, but revealed by attention. And once you understand that, you can never unlearn it. As Michael moved through the industry, people began to notice a strange pattern. He absorbed information differently. While others focused on instruction, he focused on sensation. While others memorized technique, he memorized response, how bodies reacted, how air shifted, how silence felt before sound returned. This made him difficult to categorize. Producers couldn't reduce him to formulas. Engineers couldn't fully predict him. Executives couldn't always control him. Because Michael Jackson wasn't chasing approval. He was chasing alignment. That alignment between rhythm, body, and emotion was what he defended at 12, and that instinct only sharpened with time. During later sessions, Michael would sometimes ask engineers to dim the lights. He wanted fewer visual distractions. He wanted to feel the sound, not see it. He wanted to move freely without being observed. This confused people. Why does the light matter? They ask. Michael rarely explained. But the answer was simple. He was returning to that Motown room, to that moment when listening, not watching, changed the outcome. In darkness, sound becomes physical. In darkness, the body leads. That's where the groove lives. There were sessions where Michael would ask for playback at unusually high volume, not to show off, not to overwhelm, but to feel how the bass interacted with his chest, how the snare hit his spine, how the vocal sat against his breath. Engineers would glance nervously at the meters. Michael would close his eyes. "This part," he'd say, "that's where it talks to you." And once again, it wasn't metaphor. It was perception. By the late 1970s, people stopped questioning him, not because he demanded it, but because ignoring him became impractical. His instincts kept proving correct, over and over again. But the erase button never disappeared. Technology just made it quieter, cleaner, more tempting. With digital recording, imperfections could be removed without consequence. At least, that's what people believed. Michael didn't. In fact, the more technology advanced, the more he protected the human elements. He insisted on keeping vocal textures that didn't align perfectly. He resisted quantization that drained life from rhythm. He fought against smoothing things out simply because it was possible. To Michael, possibility was not permission. Just because something could be erased didn't mean it should be. This put him at odds with trends, with the industry's obsession with flawlessness, with the illusion that control equaled quality. But Michael had learned something early that most people never do. Audiences don't fall in love with perfection. They fall in love with presence. They fall in love with the feeling that something is happening right now, even if it was recorded years ago. That feeling comes from risk, from leaving evidence that a moment could have gone wrong, but didn't. The Motown mistake was one such risk, and it taught Michael that risk, when guided by feeling, was not recklessness. It was honesty. As his fame grew, so did the myth around him. People called him obsessive, demanding, impossible to satisfy. But those labels missed the core truth. Michael wasn't obsessed with control. He was obsessed with connection. And connection requires vulnerability, even in sound. This is why his recordings still feel intimate, why they feel close even when they're grand, why listeners feel like Michael is right there with them, whispering, breathing, moving. Because he left those moments in. He didn't erase them. The 12-year-old who once stood up to an erase button became an artist who stood up to an entire industry's understanding of polish. And he did it quietly. No speeches, no manifestos, just decisions. Small, invisible decisions that added up over time. One breath kept here. One footstep left there. One groove protected from correction. Together, they formed a body of work that still moves people who weren't even alive when it was recorded. That's not an accident. That's philosophy made audible. And it all returns to one truth. Michael Jackson trusted the feeling before the explanation. That's what scared people. Because feeling can't be audited. It can't be standardized. It can't be owned. But it can be shared. And when it is, it lasts. So when we talk about iconic moments, we often look for spectacle. We look for drama we can point to. Big gestures, public triumphs. But sometimes, the most important moments are nearly erased. Sometimes they survive only because someone pauses. Sometimes history turns on a finger hovering above a button. And sometimes the voice that stops it belongs to a child who knows, without being taught, that music is alive. What people rarely understand is that moments like this don't just shape careers. They shape silence. After that Motown session, Michael began to notice silence differently. Not the absence of sound, but the space around it. The pause before a note. The fraction of a second after a beat lands. the way anticipation itself can become rhythm. Silence, he learned, was not empty. It was charged. In later years, when collaborators described working with Michael Jackson, they often talked about how much time he spent not singing. He would sit, listen, rock gently back and forth, let the track play again and again without touching the microphone. To outsiders, it looked like indecision. To Michael, it was preparation. Because he wasn't waiting to perform. He was waiting to enter. That discipline, the patience to let sound reveal itself, was born in rooms where mistakes were supposed to be eliminated. And yet, Michael found life hiding inside those imperfections. He began to understand something profound at a very young age. Music doesn't begin when you sing. It begins when you listen. This separated him from almost everyone around him. Most performers were trained to project, to deliver, to impress. Michael was trained by instinct to receive. He absorbed the room, the musicians, the subtle energy shifts that no one talked about, and when he finally sang, he wasn't imposing himself on the track. He was responding to it. That's why his voice often sounded conversational, even when it was technically complex. That's why his phrasing felt inevitable, like it couldn't have happened any other way. He wasn't forcing music into existence. He was allowing it. That erase button moment wasn't about defiance. It was about preservation. Preserving the moment where sound and feeling align. As Michael matured, this sensitivity deepened. It became both a gift and a burden. Because once you hear that deeply, the world becomes loud in a different way. Artificial things become unbearable. Forced choices become painful. Michael struggled with this as fame grew. The industry wanted efficiency. He wanted authenticity. The industry wanted repetition. He wanted discovery. This tension followed him everywhere. And yet in studios, his true refuge, he returned again and again to the same principle he defended at 12. Let it breathe. There are recordings where you can hear him snap his fingers, whisper instructions to himself, laugh softly between takes. Most artists would cut those moments. Michael kept many of them. Not because he was careless, but because he understood something rare. Intimacy creates trust. When listeners hear the human behind the performance, they lean in. They forgive. They connect. They feel invited. An invitation is far more powerful than perfection. Think about the songs that endure, the ones people return to decades later. They're rarely the cleanest recordings. They're the ones that feel alive, that feel like someone is still inside them. Michael's music feels that way because he never left the room. He didn't erase himself. The 12-year-old at Motown was already fighting for that presence, even if he didn't have the language for it yet. He simply knew what felt right. That knowledge would guide him through decades of creation, through innovation and isolation, through adoration and misunderstanding. It would also cost him, because hearing that deeply means you feel everything deeply. Joy, pressure, fear, expectation. Michael carried all of it. And yet when he stepped into a studio, he returned to the same place of clarity, sound, body, feeling. The groove. That word so casually spoken by a child would become a compass. Groove is not a beat. It's a relationship. Between sound and movement, between intention and accident, between control and surrender. Michael understood that intuitively. That's why dancers loved his music. It didn't dictate movement, it invited it. It left space for interpretation, for individuality. Just like he had left space in that recording. By not erasing the mistake, he had left room for listeners to step inside the song. That's what made it iconic. Not because it was perfect, but because it was open. As time went on, this openness became rarer in popular music. Tracks grew tighter, louder, more compressed, more controlled. But Michael resisted that compression, not just of sound but of feeling. He wanted air. He wanted motion. He wanted life. Even when the world demanded spectacle, he returned to subtlety, to breath, to groove. And that is why, long after trends fade, his music still moves bodies that weren't even born when it was made. Because the human elements weren't erased. They were protected. The erase button was still there. He just kept saying no. And in doing so, he taught generations of artists, whether they realized it or not, that authenticity is not something you add later. It's something you choose not to remove. So when you listen to Michael Jackson now, really listen. You're not just hearing songs. You're hearing decisions. Tiny, invisible decisions made in quiet rooms. Decisions to trust instinct. Decisions to honor feeling. If this continuation helped you feel the depth behind Michael Jackson's music, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who believes music should still breathe. Every subscribe keeps these stories alive, and every share ensures the groove is never erased.